Patch 8.3.0 is out, and with it brings into question the balance of a certain category of perks, hexes. Crowd Control just received a gigantic buff. Instead of blocking windows that survivors vault for up to 60 seconds, it now permanently blocks the last 5 windows that survivors vaulted, at least until the Hex totem is cleansed. And this brought a question into my mind: why can't other Hex perks be buffed to this extent? Hex perks are meant to be high risk, high reward. They're designed to have strong effects, but at the cost of being able to be permanently removed from the match by a survivor. However, that's only how they work on paper. In practice, they could be extremely frustrating to use, such as when they get cleansed right at the start of matches, or if you bring multiple and they get cleansed in the worst possible order. Some Hex perk effects aren't even that strong. In this video, I'll be going over the perks that I think need to be buffed, and the perks that I think need to be reworked. Stick around to the end of the video to see a perk that isn't even a Hex perk, but I think would suit it very well. I personally believe that Devour, Noed, Plaything, Pentimento, Ruin, and Undying are all in a really good spot already and they don't need to be changed. Devour Hope is an extremely strong perk on its own, distracting all survivors from doing generators when it's revealed to try and find it, else risk everyone being Mori'd and insta-downed. With Noed, well, I don't even need to explain why that's strong. Plaything and Pentimento complement each other extremely nicely and have their own playstyle, and Ruin is excellent at what it does, and Undying just serves as an extended warranty for one of your totems if they break and you want a refund. Hex Wretched Fate was only released recently, and I don't think it needs any changes just yet. It doesn't really play like a normal Hex perk, instead just making the Obsession choose between hunting it down or doing gens slower. But that brings us to the first list of changes that I think should be done. Buffing Hex perks with weaker effects to try and match the power that the perks should have with the risk they carry. First up, in alphabetical order, Blood Favor. This is a really interesting idea for a Hex, making the killer stronger instead of cursing the survivors. When you cause a survivor to lose a health state, all upright pallets within a 32-meter radius of that survivor are blocked by the entity for 15 seconds. This perk has seen niche usage on certain killers such as Plague, and I'm extremely glad they did away with the stupid cooldown they had on release. However, it's a Hex perk, and I believe it should have a strong, scary effect, and keeping on theme with pallets, I propose that it receives a buff to also break any downed pallets in the radius of the hit. This would be a horrifying effect for the survivor, seeing all pallets around them be eaten by the entity, and it would incentivize survivors to cleanse the totem. Hex perks like this are a rush to try and get value from them before they go down, so it would feel much better saving time on kicking pallets with the perk. This next perk buff is more of a quality of life change for killers that want to use it with large terror radiuses, such as Doctor and Wesker. You guessed it, Face the Darkness. Currently, while active, Face the Darkness causes survivors to scream after they spend 25 seconds outside of the killer's terror radius, which I always found strange. All this achieves is making the perk artificially stronger on killers who go undetectable, or making it unusable on killers with large terror radiuses. Therefore, the simple change I would make to the perk is having survivors inside the terror radius still scream just without revealing their aura for the 2 seconds. I personally love these Hex perks which activate in the middle of the trial rather than at the start, as it prevents them from being cleansed before they can get any value, but I don't think Face the Darkness should only be viable on stealth killers. On to the next. Hex Retribution is an interesting name and theme, punishing survivors for cleansing Hex totems, including itself. But the reason I find it interesting is that the aura reading punishes all survivors equally, instead of getting Retribution against the one who did it in the first place. Of course, the Oblivious could be considered Retribution enough, but I think it should be toned up a little. I suggest that the perk be buffed to give the killer aura reading on the survivor who cleansed the totem for the same duration as their Oblivious effect. That's right, 45 seconds of aura reading on one survivor. I should add, as a side note, however, that this aura reading would be lost upon entering a chase with the survivor, as to not give unnecessary wall hacks against them. Also, Vigil would be able to reduce the amount of Oblivious, therefore also reducing the aura, should they not get into a chase. I believe an aura read this long against the survivor with Oblivious would be extremely scary and add to the risk of cleansing the totem, as any killer without loud footsteps could then sneak up on them at a moment's notice. Now for a more interesting perk change. Devour and Ruin have always pretty much been in a decent spot for Hex perks, but the Hex third perk has never received the same amount of love. Hex the Third Seal makes any survivor who's been hit with any kind of attack from the killer, basic attacks or special attacks, suffer from the blindness status effect until the Hex totem is cleansed. To be honest, Third Seal being any attack including special attacks like Trickster Blades and Plague Vomit is a nice change from what the perk was originally, but blindness is probably the weakest status effect in the game. For those who don't already know what it does, it prevents aura reading. You know, that thing that survivors don't even have by default apart from downed and hooked survivors? And it's not even that good when the survivors are hooked, as the bubble still appears telling you where they are. The quote on the bottom of the Third Seal is, "She touched your skin, you bear the witch's mark." And I think, as a Hex perk, it should have more effects than that. I propose that, while it's still inflicting blindness, the third seal should also prevent curse survivors from recovering from any other status effects while performing actions. This might make the perk synergize far too well with the recently buffed Blood Echo, or any perk which inflicts Oblivious, such as Hysteria, but cool perk synergies make the game more interesting, at least in my opinion. And of course, if the Sprint Bursters are tired of staying exhausted while on gens, they can always just cleanse the totem. Now on to the last perk that I think should be buffed, before we look at the rework ideas. I was a bit reluctant to include a buff for this perk, but using it can be a bit frustrating. Hex 2 Can Play was the most recently added Hex perk before Dracula released, with a simple effect whilst totem is in play. When a survivor stuns or blinds you, they get blinded for a short duration. Unfortunately, I feel though this duration is too small, as 1.5 seconds, for the perk to deserve its spot as a Hex perk. Currently the Hex doesn't start active in the trial, and you must be stunned or blinded twice before the effect can even trigger. I think that not only should the Hex start active on a totem to try and mitigate the amount of setup that it needs, but I also believe the blind duration should be increased by a second to be 2.5. This is a simple enough change, but it should make the perk feel more consistent. Well, those were all of the Hex perk buff ideas that I think should be considered to make them feel more worthwhile using. Now onto the fun part of the video, Hex perk reworks. These are all buffs as well, but I believe they changed the gameplay of the Hexes enough just to allow them to be classed as reworks instead of just buffs. First off, still in alphabetical order, Hex Haunted Ground. This is a perk a lot of people probably expected would be unchanged, as the effect is still quite powerful, but I believe it could be quite frustrating to use in certain scenarios. I've had so many games where I'm running multiple Hex perks and all of them get cleansed apart from my Haunted Grounds. How does this happen? I don't know, statistically it shouldn't, but I'm hoping this rework can mitigate it. The perk will keep its original purpose, spawning 2 trap totems. However, all non-haunted ground totems will warn the survivor that you have the perk, by cursing you, and if they're cleansed or blessed, all survivors are exposed for the same 60 seconds, similar to the traps. When any Hex totem is cleansed, whether that's haunted ground or any other Hex perk you might be bringing, it turns off one of the traps into a dull totem. If a survivor cleanses haunted grounds first, it turns the other dull, like the perk did originally. But if they cleanse a different Hex, only one haunted ground will turn dull, keeping the perk active for another go. The counterplay here revolves around gaining the curse status when touching a non-trap totem. The survivor can decide if they want to get rid of the one they're on, removing, say, Ruin, but also exposing everyone for 60 seconds. Or they could find one of the trap totems to disable both of them in only one activation, only exposing everyone once. This is especially useful if there's a survivor in chase who's already injured, as them being exposed doesn't matter, and so hopefully the duration could end before anyone goes down. Next up is a perk that I don't really understand the flavour of in-game, Huntress Lullaby. To gain stacks on this perk, you have to hook survivors, but the flavour of the perk seems to lean more into terrifying the survivors into losing concentration, like with the Huntress's eerie lullaby. I think it would fit more thematically if the perk slowly curse survivors more and more who spend time in the terror radius. Survivors in the terror radius, but not being chased, slowly become more cursed each second, and for each second spent in the terror radius, they get skill check warnings 2% later. After spending 50 seconds in the terror radius, they're effectively the same as a 5-stack Huntress Lullaby originally. The perk would also keep the original 6% more aggression for missed skill checks, and I think this suits the perk's theme just a lot better. At 5 hooks, the game is probably almost over for either side, as the killer could have snowballed early, or nearly all the generators are complete anyway. This rework unfortunately doesn't affect better players very much, but there isn't really an easy way of doing that without completely ruining more casual survivors. The original Hex Thrill of the Hunt has nothing to do with thrill nor hunting, and I seek to change that. Right now in-game you start with all 5 stacks and you lose them when totems are cleansed. I however think the killer should work for these stacks, eventually making cleansing totems an extreme task. When you chase survivors and let them escape, like play with your food, you earn tokens, and you see the aura of all other survivors for 2 seconds. Unlike play with your food, however, the cooldown is per survivor rather than on the perk itself. Each token functions the same as the perk does right now, but instead of being able to be stacked up to 10 instead of 5, meaning at maximum stacks, totems take twice as long to cleanse. Please don't try blessing any Hex totems under the effect of a 10-stack Thrill of the Hunt. Speaking of blessing totems, it's time for the final perk. This wasn't originally a Hex perk, but it's also extremely useless and was added as a band-aid solution to the Circle of Healing problem when it released, before they finally fixed that perk. That's right, Shattered Hope. I think the worst feeling in the world is bringing a Hex perk and having it cleansed instantly, and so I think Shattered Hope should have a bonus effect of the entity blocking all Hex totems for the first minute of the match. Of course, that brings into the question, what should the active effect be? Well, as some of you may already know, right now the perk lets you kick boon totems and break them completely. However, boons aren't strong enough for this to actually be a good thing, unless you're also running Pentimento. That's why I suggest, instead of breaking them, it replaces them with an instance of Hex Shattered Hope. When a survivor first enters a 24-meter range of a Hex totem, including if they were within that range when the totem was created, their aura is revealed for 4 seconds. This effect is refreshed if they leave the range and re-enter it, and while an instance of Hex Shattered Hope is active, survivors who start the Bless interaction with any totem suffer from the Oblivious Status effect lingering for 15 seconds after it's cancelled or completed. This might be a bit ambitious, as Behaviour hate changing default perks, but it's been 2 years since the meta shakeup, and the game has fallen back into quite a rigid meta. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Whether you sat through the whole thing, or just skipped to the perks that interested you, I appreciate it. And as always, I hope you have a nice rest of your day.